Hello and welcome to Standard for Managing a Bank Account. This is a really interesting standard because it's evolved so much in the last 10 years. When the mandate was passed a little over 10 years ago, it was actually balancing a checkbook. And so obviously things have changed a lot, which I think is also a great nod or acknowledgement to just how much there is involved in teaching personal finance. Things are changing rapidly in the finance industry. And so that's why we're here, is to help in these changes and to make sure that we are always up to date in what we're talking to the students about, which is now managing a bank account versus balancing a check register, and how and there's so much more involved in that, and with lots of new features and updates to that. So here to visit with us today about the State Department curriculum is Carrie Hickson from Mustang High School, and she is going to walk us through the curriculum from the State Department of Education on Standard 4, managing a bank account. So I'll hand it over to you, Mrs. Hickson.
Thanks, Amy. I appreciate that. Yeah, standard for managing a bank account. So, as the teacher guide states, this lesson is designed to show students the importance of taking the time to manage their bank account. And it also shows the appropriate steps in writing a check and reconciling a bank statement. Says while most banking today is more automated, this lesson helps students understand the fundamentals of good money management skills. I think that these are skills that most students don't even know they need to learn because a lot of adults in their lives don't even practice these. So, what are some of these skills? Well, it says that students would be able to distinguish between when to use a check and what a check is, what a debit card is and when to use it, and then an ATM machine, also kind of how they interact with each other. It also is to help students demonstrate the ability to balance a checkbook and to reconcile a statement. I've heard many adults who teach personal finance state that they don't think it's necessary for students to know how to write a check, how to fill out a deposit slip, or how to complete a checkbook register because everything is done online now. Personally, I disagree with this statement because, as the module points out, these skills are still needed in certain situations. And if students have a better understanding of the basics, then they will be better able to understand how the online versions work and the importance of monitoring their bank accounts. If you happen to be someone who's never been taught how to do these things, this lesson will help you also. I know that personally, I've learned a lot about personal finance by teaching personal finance, and sharing with students some of our hard earned life lessons can help them relate better to what's being taught and why they need to learn it. So, the lesson presentation has a slide with discussions that can help generate some interest and discussion over this topic. Very few of my students have ever written a check. In fact, I usually ask the question, how many of y'all have? And occasionally I get a few hands that go up. So it could be beneficial to explain situations where this skill or these skills are still needed, such as paying rent to your landlord or buying a school yearbook. The module even brings out some other scenarios where it might come into play. So it's important, I think, to still teach this and to let students know why they still need to learn this. The lesson begins by explaining what checks and debit cards are and some of the benefits and costs of using them. Again, many of my students haven't even considered any of this because it's just something they've grown up with and really haven't put a lot of thought into. The lesson goes on to describe how to write a check and how to complete a deposit slip. I mentioned to my students that these are just basic skills that anyone who has a checking account should be able to do. I personally make copies of some practice checks and deposit slips that I have the students complete while we're going over this information as part of like their notes. I tell them that they will be able to use these when they do their homework assignment, which will be activity 4.1 later on in the lesson. But I find that if students are actually filling out the check or deposit slip, that it helps this skill sink in a little more. The next item discussed in the student lesson is the checkbook register. There's a video that's listed in the teacher guide on how to balance your checkbook. That would be really good to show at this time. It explains what a checkbook register is and the hows and whys of using one. They talk about the paper checkbook registers, but the example that they use is actually an online one that they have downloaded. So students can see how they can use technology to current day do what would be an old school skill, but that is still necessary. And showing videos, I've noticed that students typically stay a little more engaged when I can find a short video clip to include in a lesson instead of just listening to me. As a part of this, overdrafting is also mentioned again, and why it's such a problem. I know it was brought up in Standard 3, but I think it needs to be re-emphasized again that this can lead to a lot of excessive fees if students overdraw their account through the bank. And if it's done too frequently, it can cause banks to close their accounts and could even lead to jail time with students if they are continuing to write hot checks or not use their account well. The last part of the module teaches students how to reconcile their accounts. And I just explained that this is a big word that means to come to an agreement. They want their checkbook register to agree with the bank statement. So I go over an example with the students in class so that they can understand the concept a little more. Then the students can practice their knowledge and skills with activity 4.1, where they will use a checkbook register and they can practice writing checks and deposit slips. And so if I can share my screen here to show you what this looks like. So this is the activity that is in the student lesson for students to do. And it says to complete the following transaction using the checks in the check register provided. They will need to write each check individually and then enter the transaction into the register. And it gives them a balance to start with. And then here are the different scenarios that they will be doing. They will buy a pair of jeans and tells them how much it's for, who the check is to, the date that they're writing the check and the check number. And it just goes through several different scenarios here. Sorry, that went a little fast. And here's their checkbook register where they will be recording that check number, the date of the transaction, the description, whether it was a payment or a deposit, and then they're going to keep a running balance. And then it also includes some deposit slips so that they can fill out a deposit slip, and it includes checks. Now these could be some of the checks or deposit slips that you could print off and then cut them out individually to give to students when you are teaching the lesson so they can make some notes on these. And so when they come in to actually do this part of the lesson, they can have that, as I mentioned earlier, as some of their notes to help them as they're doing that. So this would just be an example of one of the activities that is offered here that is, I think, really good for helping students in this area. There are other activities that are similar to this that you could use also that are not just doing the checkbook register and the checks, but also help them to reconcile these accounts. Better Money Habits curriculum has one that could be used along with Next Gen Personal Finance has a lesson over this. So if you have the time to do this extra activity, that would probably be something that would be helpful for students and a resource to go to. The lesson also has a game like bingo, I think they call it Banko, to help students review some of the terms that are used in this. I've also been known to use, have bell ringers several more times during the semester where students have to pick up a blank check or deposit slip and practice this skill again and again. Because if they only do it once during this standard, they're probably going to forget it by the time they get to the end, or at least I've found that to be so. And so if occasionally you throw in a bell ringer where they have to pick up a blank check and you give them a scenario, write a check for, it just integrates this throughout the rest of the semester. One of the questions I ask once we're going through this, a lot of times I'll ask them if these concepts and skills are hard. And most students will go, no. I then ask them if they're tedious. And the answer is yes, especially the reconciling the checkbook register. And I remind them that practicing good money management is not always fun, but it is important if they want to keep the money that they've worked so hard to earn. If they don't, then they're going to waste a lot of their hard-earned money on fees to the bank instead of spending it or saving it for something that they want. So I hope you can see the value in teaching these concepts to students, and maybe for some of you in practicing them yourselves. And apologize for the cuckoo clock that just went off. Welcome to my house. Amy, back to you.
Okay, great. And I love the cuckoo clock. That's perfect. That's a great time to have a segue. Well, you mentioned a lot of great resources. Next Gen is definitely a great resource to go and find extra activities. You also mentioned Better Money Habits, and that curriculum, and for those that aren't familiar with it, can be found on Econ EdLink. That's a great website full of searchable tools and resources. And so the curriculum for Better Money Habits can be found on Econ EdLink, but then Better Money Habits is a whole series of fantastic videos that are short, about 2 to 3 minutes max. That's about an average time that educators can go and find some great videos that really cover a multitude of our standards.
Yes.
So those were great resources mentioned. So Carrie, when you teach this, are there some typical questions that come up or things that that students get hung up on that teachers might anticipate when going through the standard?
I think a lot of times students don't understand the reasoning why they need to keep track of their account on their own. They just think that if they log on to their bank's app, the bank's app tells them how much they've spent and how much they still have in their account. And they don't realize that that's only the information that the bank knows about, not everything that they have done on their own. So if they've written a check, the bank doesn't know about that until that person that they've written the check to cashes it. Mm-hmm. And so if they have written a check and they've forgotten about it, they could spend that money without realizing that the check has not gone through yet. I also, a lot of students will buy gas using their debit card. And I know 7-Eleven in the past, my students are the ones that have actually told me this, it will hit your account for about $1 for the first, when you first do it. And it will take at least 24 hours for the rest of the amount of the transaction to be processed. And so it would be very easy for them, if they just looked on their bank's app, to forget that they filled up their car this morning and then go spend that money on snacks or dinner that night with their friends. And then they will have overdrawn their account and end up in trouble. So the fact that they need to be keeping their own records of this, I think it's a new concept, and it's hard for them to understand at first, and because it is tedious, something that they would have to do. So.
Yeah. That's a great point, Carrie. We, at the council, we have lots of board members that serve on banks, and I hear stories all the time of I think people of all ages, but particularly young people that will come into the bank and they're like, oh my God, my money is gone or something's going on. So that's definitely happening. And so they'll sit down with them, or they'll have stories of their tellers that will sit down with them and it's like, okay, well, let's figure out what's going on. And then as they go through it, there's not any money missing. It's all there or not there, yes, based on their what they're spending. And so right. I think just another really good point. It is happening, and students are getting, they're going to the banks trying to figure out where their money is. So how important it is to reinforce keeping track of it and not just relying on what your app says. So that's exactly a great point. So. Okay, well, Carrie, thank you so much for joining us to discuss Standard 4 and all the complexities of it and the reasons why it's so important, and the State Department curriculum. So, all right.
Thank you for having me, Amy.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.